From the moment we're thrown into this world, we're fated to bring each other nothing but pain and misery.
When the first Metal Gear Solid was released for the PlayStation in 1998, it opened up a chapter of video game history whose magnitude no one at the time, most likely not even the series creator Hideo Kojima himself, could have remotely anticipated. But I'm neither talking about the quality, longevity, commercial success, nor its convoluted story arc of epic proportions. No, I'm talking about the way in which never-before-seen features like Psycho Mantis's legendary fourth wall break introduced the world to the unmistakable handwriting of a creator whose creed has always been to break standing conventions in order to evolve video games into the next evolutionary step. A frisky and bold visionary whose prime directive is to
boldly go where no one has gone before.
Sorry, that was corny. Hideo Kojima originally aspired wholeheartedly to become a filmmaker. This is a man who lives and breathes film, but ultimately ended up as a game designer for Konami for a number of reasons. This aspect of his career, from time to time, gets brought up as a spiteful questioning of his qualities as a creator. He wasn't good enough to get into film, so he stooped to make video games. I think, so what? Here's a game designer who understands like few others in the industry the importance of not cheaply parodying the big sister film, but to fully use the unique capabilities of the medium of video games in order to endow stories with meaning that no other medium could convey in this magnitude. What happens when you free such a thorn in the side of every profit-oriented investor from all the corporate shackles he's been constrained under for nearly 3 decades and give him access to all the creative means and freedom he desires? Apparently, his answer to that question is Death Stranding. Since the first trailer aired about half a year ago, several people behind the game's curtains, including the director himself, had vividly proclaimed how this undertaking of his will not only uphold Kojima's tradition of overstepping boundaries of contemporary game design conventions, they went as far as claiming that it would be an evolution of the way we perceive video games like nothing we've seen before, and that we are not ready. As it happens, I was already working on a video essay that would fundamentally deconstruct the concept of the HomoLudens in order to unravel what Kojima might be planning to be the figurative rope in his stick and rope metaphor. But now, with the release of the game's second trailer at the Game Awards in early December, a lot of what it showed seemed to immediately confirm this hypothesis I was working on. So let's break it all down, one by one, and once again dive into Kojima's rabbit hole of megalomaniacal ideas. Because what's clear to me now is that with Death Stranding, he doesn't just aim to break the fourth wall anymore. He wants to shatter it beyond any semblance of repair. But man, little did I suspect that this part about evolution, he might actually mean it literally. An idea is like a seed. Once planted in a person's mind, its growth is determined by how well it is nourished. Without lasting relevance, it might wither and die or become ousted by other ideas that occupy a larger space in the mind space of the host. Some ideas, though, strike roots and grow from a captivating notion into a fundamental ideology that overshadows and influences every thought that blossoms in its wake. Psycho Mantis is one of Kojima's characters that encapsulates several seeds that stuck and gradually grew into a majestic tree, casting its shadow on the way his ideas have evolved and taken shape over the years. And even though he's not going to be an actual character in Death Stranding, his ideological footprints are scattered all over the game's symbolic language. Now, since not everybody is familiar with the story of Tredje Rybionak, the third child, and the implications his character had on the Metal Gear universe and the gravity of the game's mechanics as a narrative metaphor, let's take a brief look at his seminal encounter with Solid Snake during the Shadow Moses incident, because this is really important. During Snake's infiltration of the secret Alaskan military base, his COs brief him on the presence of several high-tier Foxhound special operatives on the island. Among them, a powerful psychic known as Psycho Mantis, whose uncanny mind control capabilities appear several times in the form of hallucinations and reveries until the two have their eventual standoff. It is then, as Psycho Mantis unveils himself to Snake, that he shows his true powers. His mind ventures out of the game's capsule of suspension of disbelief and lets the player themselves, not Snake, know that he is aware of their presence in front of the screen. He switches the television channel, rendering Snake effectively blind, and he reads not only his but the player's mind by accessing the information stored on the player's memory card and making remarks about the games they're currently playing. In the actual fight, he easily dodges every single one of Snake's attacks as he can predict his every movement, and this can only be circumvented by swapping the PlayStation controller to the second port and thereby denying him of his ability to read Snake's, the player's, mind. Now, the stylistic device of breaking the fourth wall in and of itself is nothing special and quite common in all forms of fictional media. Metal Gear Solid itself, especially in the dialogues with Miller, has several lines that are openly addressed at the player, but usually this is done with a smirk, a whimsical joke by the writer to acknowledge the observant audience's presence. But Psycho Mantis goes not one, but several steps beyond that. The entire design of this boss fight was made with the intention of using means that were outside of the game designer's toolkit. It deliberately required the player to abandon the story's layer of suspension of disbelief and acknowledge that they, as in the real person in front of the screen, had to physically interact with their hardware to challenge Psycho Mantis's powers. In that moment, the relation between the gamer and the self-contained diorama of their game's narrative evolved into a bidirectional communication in which characters are aware of the presence of the outside world. This idea, at the time definitely eye-opening, but still viewed by many as an extremely tongue-in-cheek game designer joke without massive implications for the overall meaning of Metal Gear's universe, this notion has struck roots. It grew and over time continually evolved into one of the core principles behind Kojima's vision for Death Stranding. Relation. Everything is connected. Even though we only have roughly 10 minutes of footage from 2 trailers and a company logo movie, we can already find an abundance of broad hints suggesting that Death Stranding will expand on this idea of an in-game universe that's not just subliminally aware of the outside world, but where the fourth wall between the audience and the game is completely removed. Our reality is bleeding into the world of Death Stranding. You remember how I talked about the oil, prevalent in both trailers, is a symbol for mankind's exploitation of nature, the blood of the earth analogy in my previous video on Death Stranding? If you haven't seen it, well, here's the link, but I don't hold it against you if you don't want to watch a half-hour-long video essay just to brush up for this one. So I'm gonna include brief cornerstones of all the previous points I'll reference in this video, okay? So, with Death Stranding's imagery and concepts from William Blake's poem shown in the first trailer hinting at mankind's careless exploitation and desecration of nature, and even with the notion of a cataclysmic state of war as depicted in the second trailer, it's interesting how and where the oil shows up. Handprints filled with oil, Norman Reedus' hands themselves covered in oil implying blood, the blood of the earth on his hands, and oil running down the walls behind Guillermo del Toro while he assumes the infant, just like we can see it dripping down Mads Mikkelsen's gorgeous face. I use the word assume here on purpose, since oil, or generally oily liquid substances, are actually not an uncommon metaphor for otherworldly forces or beings seizing control over another species. Think of the X-Files, where the black oil, also known as purity, serves as the carrier medium for an alien life form to infect and assume control over other species. Now, think about what Kojima hinted at for the meaning of the title Death Stranding. Something from another world has stranded. But in this case, it's not an alien life form. It's us. Our world is leaking into the reality of Death Stranding. We are entering this world through the means of video games, and we directly assume the characters in this world. I mean, technically, we've been doing this all along in video games, but in this case, it's not through this imaginative layer of suspension of disbelief. In Death Stranding, the world is conscious and fully aware of our existence as the HomoLudens. Now, before I go into what this might mean for how the actual game plays out in contrast to the way we're used to play video games, what does HomoLudens actually mean? The term was coined by the Dutch cultural historian and anthropologist Johan Huizinga in his eponymous book called, HomoLudens. It explores the role and significance of play in culture and society, suggesting that the element of play is a primary and necessary condition for the generation of culture. Unlike all other studies and examinations that preceded his work, HomoLudens tried to not just describe the how, meaning the role of play in culture, but it was the first attempt to tackle the why, how play contributes to the development of culture in the first place. Now, it's important to notice that it's not just addressing play as in playing games, but since the word ludens is a conjugation of the Latin word ludum, which is commonly translated with play or game, it equally applies to sport, acting, school, and practice. It explores these concepts in relation to many different aspects of culture, such as law, war, shared knowledge, art, poetry, philosophy, and so on. On a side note, it's actually a very interesting read while taking Hideo Kojima and the way he works and thinks into account, because you can find a lot of typical notions he translates into his games in Huizinga's book. For example, one chapter focuses on play in relation to the elements of mythopoesis, the making of myths, and it almost reads like a blueprint for the rise of legend of Big Boss as depicted in The Phantom Pain. Or you can even find astonishing parallels in how Kojima himself understands to use these principles through the currents of modern media to draw public attention to his work, establishing this elusive, mysterious persona that makes fans overanalyze and obsess over every single word he says. Hey, don't look at me like that. Now, the book's final chapter is where it gets really interesting in regards to Death Stranding. It reaches the conclusion that since civilization doesn't just come from play, but arises in and as play, that as a result, civilization has given rise to a subspecies of humankind that evolved through play, the HomoLudens. This name is a play on the scientific name of the human species, the Homo sapiens, with Homo being the human genus, also including Neanderthals and other extinct species of hominid, and sapiens deriving from the Latin word sapere, meaning wise, knowing, rational. HomoLudens is usually translated with the playing man, although we gotta keep in mind the distinction that ludens doesn't only translate to playing games. But what does this all mean in the context of Kojima's new game? After all, you might say that he stated in several interviews that his HomoLudens character shown in the logo movie and on the company website is nothing but a company mascot and has nothing to do with the game itself. But we all know that he's a prankster who loves to toy with his audience's perception and that we can't take everything he says at face value. And in addition to that, there are also numerous hints that this is yet another Kojima deception. For instance, I already mentioned in my last video that the face we see inside the suit in one of the promotional pictures looks uncannily like Norman Reedus himself, and that was already at a time when Kojima had stated that no, this is not Reedus, this is actually a shot of him. But come on, that's wishful thinking. That is not Hideo Kojima. That's Norman Reedus. Think about it. The 3D representation of naked Norman in the first trailer has the real tattoos of the actor rendered on the model. Now, why would the artists even go the extra mile to include a visual aspect that actively takes away from the game's suspension of disbelief? Now, add to that the fact that the protagonist in the second trailer is portrayed by Guillermo del Toro, but when you look at the end credits, it mentions only Norman Reedus and Mads Mikkelsen to be starring in the game. This is not a character played by Guillermo del Toro. This is Guillermo, just as this is Norman Reedus, their embodiment as HomoLudens within the virtual universe of Death Stranding. Even the Kojima Productions logo movie is directly tied to the trailer. Aside from Moby Dick, the almost universal allegory for mankind leaning arms against superior forces of nature, was already hidden in trailer number 1, resurfacing in the Ludens trailer. Whoop, there he is. We can also clearly see that it plays on the surface of the moon, with the planetary constellation of the Earth and Sun in the background indicating that the moon is fully illuminated by the sun. Full moon. We can also see a part of the Earth that's currently in daytime, from where it's possible to see the moon as well. And this is where the second trailer of Death Stranding is taking place, right this very moment. You probably remember the quote-unquote inverted rainbow shown briefly in the beginning of the second trailer, right? Such a phenomenon does in fact occur in nature, but it is not a rainbow. A rainbow is caused by reflection, refraction, and dispersion of sunlight in water droplets or vapor, resulting in a spectrum of light appearing in the sky. But with the sunlight's possible range of entry angles, it is virtually impossible for a rainbow to appear in such an elevated position that it appears upside down to the observer. This is called a circumzenithal arc or Bravais arc. It's similar in appearance but belongs to the family of halos and arises from refraction of light through ice crystals rather than raindrops. It can be caused by sunlight, but a specific type of this phenomenon, which is not as uncommon as most people might think, is the lunar circumzenithal arc, which tends to originate when the moon is very bright, as in full moon, and ideally when the light source enters the Earth's atmosphere at an angle of around 20 degrees. And this is almost exactly what the constellation in the Kojima Productions movie depicts. According to the theories established in Charles Darwin's 1859 publication On the Origin of Species and the evolutionary biological research that built on this foundation, the natural course of biological life took an estimated 3.5 billion years until the Homo sapiens emerged from the last universal common ancestor. Species reproduce following the biological imperative, their offspring become subject to seemingly random genetic mutations, and through natural selection and extinction, new species emerge and those fit for survival persist, while the rest dies out through failure of continuing their respective hereditary branch. This ongoing formation of new species, or even new subspecies, is a gradual process that takes millions of years. But the emergence of mankind as a cultural species, through shared language, common knowledge, the abstract comprehension of past, present, and future, and ultimately its sedentary lifestyle that's largely atypical for mammals, has put a fundamental twist on the slow mills of Darwinian evolution and rendered natural selection, at least in part, obsolete. To quote one of the great philosophers of our time,
"There is another organism on this planet that follows the same pattern. Do you know what it is? A virus."
This drastic change in evolutionary dynamics, driving ecological balance past every conceivable natural threshold, strongly hints at an impending cataclysmic event. And that's a theme of Death Stranding. Remember, the end of times, rapture, humanity being reprimanded for their lifestyle? Anyway, evolution. Since it would take tens of thousands of years for the human species to evolve into a new subspecies naturally, according to the studies of evolutionary dynamics and evolutionary game theory, the logical leap would be a cultural evolution of mankind, fueled by the fruits of civilization, science, technology, and shared knowledge.
That selfish and atavistic desire to pass on one's seed was enough to make me sick. Every living thing on this planet exists to mindlessly pass on their DNA. We're designed that way. And that's why there is war. But you are different. You're the same as us. We have no past, no future. We live in the moment. That's our only purpose.
This is Kojima's idea for the role of HomoLudens in Death Stranding, the technological realization of a cultural evolution of mankind that has already taken place through technology. You could say that with Death Stranding, Kojima Productions is creating the natural habitat for the HomoLudens through the means of technology, through video games. It's just what it says on the tin. From sapiens to ludens. A lot of what we're shown supports this idea. The very first character we've come to witness starts out naked, on the ground, in a fetal position, how his creator made him. Strong symbolism for the birth of a new race. In both trailers, a strong emphasis is put on the importance of infants, fetuses, and babies. The main character crying while clutching the baby with its umbilical cord still in place, while in the second trailer, we see a shattered baby doll that bears the same abdominal marks as Norman's character. We see Guillermo's character attaching what appears like a biomechanical cable to a pod with a fetus inside and activating it in the process. All this imagery of newborn children points at the biological imperative I've talked about, the evolutionary drive to procreate and ensure the heritage of a species, a new and still fragile race. Death Stranding is a world for a species that's evolved through play, realized by the means of play. A world in which video game mechanics don't have to be blanked out of the player's perception to maintain the narrative suspension of disbelief, but in which video game logic is made literal. Think of the way Mads Mikkelsen's character takes off his night vision goggles. They evaporate into nothingness, accompanied by an explosion of red glowing particles. This is how video games work. You unequip an item and it vanishes into thin air, stored into hammer space, an imaginary inventory that can hold impossibly large items far over capacity. Think of the strands, the black umbilical cords that connect everything. Mikkelsen's character is directly connected with the skull-faced soldiers and controls their actions, not verbally but through gestures. And when they carry out his order, another cloud of red glowing particles appears. Those strands are almost like a physical manifestation of dependency trees in object-oriented or visual programming languages. Now, what this means for the actual game and how it will play out in the end is still hazy and subject to speculation, let that be clear. So now we're gonna venture even further into speculation territory. But remember how during the development of Silent Hills, even with the little information we got before it was cancelled, it had been heavily implied on numerous occasions that the added S in the title of the game might represent a universe in which each player would, in some form, experience their own manifestation of Silent Hill. The actual game might be dead, but its core ideas live on in Death Stranding. The modern armament of the soldiers and Kojima's stick and rope analogy suggest that on a surface level, the game will indeed feel very familiar to people who are acquainted with games like Tom Clancy's The Division and the Uncharted series, meaning its moment-to-moment gameplay will likely play and feel like a standard modern third-person shooter. If you don't care in the world for all the science and philosophy jibber-jabber that gets pretentious Sherlock Holmes wannabes like myself aroused, you can. You can just play it and shoot people and don't give a damn about all of this like you've enjoyed it all along. But on a meta level, Death Stranding will introduce fundamental twists on how we interact with each other through online play and how we experience player death. Some people have already pointed out that if you sync both trailers, for example, we see Guillermo move along with the camera simultaneously with the handprints forming in the sand. Norman Reedus' character's abdomen is covered with a large cross-shaped scar, while the destroyed baby doll floating through the muddy water in the second trailer bears very similar markings in the same place on its body. Already said that. It indicates that right now, Norman's character might be in a state of death or rebirth. And in the moment Guillermo connects the fetus tank to the cable, the baby in Norman's hand disappears, almost as if Del Toro just activated an extra life. And right after that, baby handprints appear on Norman Reedus, and we see them leave similar traces on his body as the other hand markings already all over him. Signs of how he's been assumed several times in the past already. The way those handprints appear in the sand simultaneously to Del Toro's movement made me think of the ghostly apparitions of other players in the Dark Souls and Bloodborne games, where you see how other people that are playing right now have died in exactly the spot you're in. We all experience our own story while simultaneously sharing a combined universe, explaining each player's individual single-player experience within the narrative frame of the game. And since Mikkelsen's character was announced to play the antagonist of the game, and he too is covered in black oil while giving orders to his subordinates, just like in a video game, it might even hint at a game mechanic that's comparable to the invasion system of the Souls series. But as I said, so far it's up to speculation, and I'd like to avoid throwing in too many guesses without having anything to back up my claims. Educated guesswork is all we can do at this point, and honestly, I think it's already made for an extremely enjoyable scavenger hunt so far. But I'm quite convinced about the focal points and conclusions of this video essay, since the theme of mankind's evolution into the Domus Ludi resonates perfectly with all the symbolic imagery we've been littered with so far. From the way Hideo Kojima crafts his games and mischievously weaves his plots, my gut instinct tells me that those ludo-evolutionary elements will unfold with a pacing and structure comparable to the story of Big Boss / Punished Snake / the clone of Legend in Metal Gear Solid 5, establishing an air of familiarity for players for quite some time, only to gain momentum to unleash the seminal twist. That, yes, our world and this world are directly tied to each other and are fully aware of each other's existence. And yes, you're not the only Homo sapiens entering this world, but we will meet each other in a drastic reinterpretation of shared online gaming. And yes, that the HomoLudens turns out not to just be a company mascot, but an integral and central part of this universe and its lore, a habitat that was made for a culturally evolved subspecies of mankind that arose through the tenets of modern civilization itself.
Humans weren't designed to bring each other happiness. From the moment we're thrown into this world, we're fated to bring each other nothing but pain and misery.
So, yes, something from another world did strand in the world of Death Stranding. It is us, the HomoLudens, and we bring the sins of our fathers to its shores. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to subscribe for more videos on Death Stranding and episodes of Monsters of the Week every other week. And as always, a big thank you to all the people who support my channel on Patreon. This time with a special thanks going out to Caroline Mills, Simon Anderson, Lucas, Evan Tekru, Marissa Martinez, Michelle Stoliker, Kelvin Bombach, Adele Al-Falasi, Christopher Kalish, Nicholas Stevenson, Ronnie Meinert, Ian Melancon, Dewey Wayu Hendrayani, Nelson Velez, Jose Garcia, and Jordan. So until next time, remember, the truth is out there.